Well, welcome everybody to this edition of GWO's webinar series. Today, we're going to be focusing on the updates to GWO's requirements, both requirements for training and requirements for certification bodies. My name is Dan Ortega. I'm the North American representative for GWO. I'm based in the United States, and I'm here just as the moderator and host. And also on this call today is my friend Jose. He is our lead over our requirements, and he's going to jump in and start out by giving us an overview of the changes to the requirements for training and the requirements for certification. There is a Q&A that we have scheduled for today. So on Zoom, if you're not familiar, on the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A icon that you can type your questions in. And after Jose reviews the changes to the requirements, we'll be answering each one of those questions. Additionally, we're going to take a little bit of time at the end of this webinar to discuss specifically some of the changes in the requirements regarding multi-site certifications. So if you have or are considering having multiple GWO training locations, that section will be particularly interesting to you. So I'm going to turn it over to Jose, who's going to run through the summary of the changes. Again, as the webinar is going, please type your answers, or excuse me, your questions in the Q&A box, and we will answer those after this initial presentation. So Jose, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Dan, and good morning or good afternoon, even good evening, depending on the region where you are today. As Dan mentioned, we are going to provide an update today on the most relevant changes in the reviewed requirements, both for training and certification. As you are all aware, there was a new version of the requirements released at the 2nd of May, and there's some relevant changes to the requirements, which we will go through now. And then, as Dan mentioned, we will be discussing in a bit more detail the the multi-site scheme, which was released in October of last year and has been piloted over the last 6 months or so, and learn is captured in the reviewed requirements. So I'd like to start with the requirements for training, because as you are all aware, the requirements for training is our norm, our scheme, our standard that training providers must comply with. And the way the compliance with the requirements for training is validated is explained in the requirements for certification, which basically covers how the auditors need to verify compliance, including the frequency of the audits that need to happen for this purpose. So as you will have seen, both documents have been renamed from requirements for training providers to requirements for training, and requirements for certification bodies to requirements for certification. Because in the end, both documents are equally applicable to training providers or certification bodies. Auditors and certification bodies must be familiar with the requirements for training, because they are going to audit against it. And training providers must be familiar with the requirements for certification, because that's what they will need to comply with in order to get the initial certification and then maintain the certification through the surveillance audits. So that's to start with the change in the name for both documents. You will see also that there's been some changes in the numbering in the requirements, which is detailed in the change log, both documents. And now we go into the changes. There's the addition, which I show as new here, is just trying to reinforce the fact that the requirements for certification, which we call requirements for certification bodies, the requirements for certification must be known, understood by the training providers. We've seen instances in the past in which surveillance audits had not been done, and then the training provider was explaining that they had not been contacted by the certification body, and in some cases there was some confusion about whether they had to do surveillance audits or not to maintain the certification. So that's why it's important that the training providers are familiar with the requirements for certification. There's been a clarification in 7.2.9 in these situations where you are using the on-site training certification for example, market testing purposes. So the requirements for on-site training give the option for a training provider to deliver training in a facility which may not be a facility designed, initially for training provider for providing training, and then there's a chance to do this during 12 months. But then, if after 12 months there's a decision from the training provider that they'd like to continue delivering training there, then there's a need to convert this into a fixed training facility. There was another confusion, which the qualification of instructors and whether the observation of training to qualify instructors was specific to each of the modules the instructor was aiming to deliver. And the answer for this is yes, and that's now fully clear in the requirements for training. So some of the modifications, as you will know, have been to clarify further requirements that basically have not changed, but may seem confusing because of the way they were written. So moving on with the changes in the requirements for training, 9.3.3 is a fundamental change in the requirements for training. Actually, I think that is one of the most relevant changes in both requirements. We have historically seen that auditors, sampling records of training, were unsure, whether the duration for PST, for example, had to be 40 hours, and that would apply for 2 people or for 6 people with 1 instructor. The reality is that we've seen that the duration of the standards was adjusted in some cases to the number of participants. Of course, the less number of participants, the less time you need for all the participants to do a training exercise. So something that we have done is just including the requirements that this is an option, that the training providers can go for, as long as they can verify that the learning objectives can be achieved. However, it's important to remark that this is only possible, once the session is starting and we see that there's 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 participants engaged. But the training providers cannot advertise shorter versions or shorter durations for the modules, because that could be unfair. When you advertise module and you advertise the price of that module, you're not going to know whether there's going to be 1 or 6 people joining. So you cannot advertise this as, well, because there's going to be 2 people, the BST is going to take 3 days. So all the courses you advertise must be to the maximum ratio. But then when you deliver the training, you can, as long as you achieve the learning objectives, adjust this to the number of participants. Section 5 again is just to reinforce, that as a training provider, you have a responsibility to understand the requirements to maintain your certification. And ideally, the certification body could contact the training provider to schedule the surveillance audit. If that's not the case, then this is a reminder that the training provider needs to be aware that annually they need to go through a surveillance audit, and just to make sure that surveillance audits are not missed. Something that you will note as well is that all the references to certification have been moved from the requirements for training to the requirements for certification. So when we were detailing in the section 8 for the different training settings, what the certification requirements were for each, this has now been transferred to the requirements for certification. And in the training settings, basically, it is explained, what does each of the setting mean, and what does it take to say this is an on-site training or this is a mobile training. So that's the purpose behind this. Then you will see that there's been a change in the way you report incidents. So there's an expectation that all the incidents are now reported online through the link that you can see here. So we are digitizing the reporting of incidents. And now we're gonna transfer to the requirements for certification, and you will see, some more changes here. So there's a change, that says, and that's irrelevant, more than a change is actually a clarification. There was a doubt from training providers and auditors regards, okay, if there's a new version of a standard, do I need to certify the training provider against this new version or not? So 6.1.5 has been introduced to make clear that there's not a need to do an extraordinary audit if there's a change in the standard and there's a new version. However, logically, in the next surveillance audit, this will be checked, this will be validated, but without the need for an extraordinary audit, just with the purpose of doing so. There was also some question, there were some doubts about what happens if I change the location of my training facility. Do all the modules need to be witnessed again? Or what type of audit do we need to go through? So you're just changing the location, you're not changing the instructors, you're not changing the lesson plans. The only thing you're doing is just changing the location. So there needs to be an extraordinary audit just to verify that the location is safe to deliver training and that you have the physical equipment needed to deliver the training. So if you had a simulator in your old fixed facility, you still have the simulator in your new facility. For this, you will contact the certification body and you will ask for an extraordinary audit just to validate this type of things. And after this verification, then the certificate, you know, could be the same, except in just the address of the new location. There is also a clarification included that the initial certification for training providers, there's stage 1, which is like a pre-audit, is a readiness review, and then in stage 2, there's one section where you verify compliance with the QMS and sampling of records, and then there's another part which is the witnessing of training. The only scenario in which the audit need to be through a physical visit is the witnessing of training. In the other two, stage 1 and the QMS audit portion in stage 2, the training provider and the certification body can agree on whether they'd like to do this physically or they'd like to do this through an online meeting, through Teams or through Zoom or any other way. Now, 6.3.10 is again most likely the most relevant change, or one of the most relevant changes in the requirements for certification. If we recall the previous versions, if we were delivering one standard in various settings, so for example, fixed training facility and mobile training facility, there had to be witnessing of training for each of the settings, even though the standard could be the same and the learning objectives in the standard could be the same. So we've been listening to training providers and the reality, and we've been working with certification bodies, and there's an agreement that there's not a need to witness training in the different settings more than once. So as long as the lesson plan and the training materials are the same in all the settings, there's not a need to do witnessing of the same standard in the various settings. Logically, there needs to be a verification that if you deliver, on-site training for a standard, you have the right equipment to deliver on-site. And likewise, there is a need to verify that the risks for the new setting have been addressed. And this is, I think, mostly visible when you go through the on-site setting, where you may be developing, certain standards in a wind turbine or similar. But this is again a fundamental change which simplifies enormously the initial certification for a training provider to deliver one standard in the various settings.
Jose, I want to jump in real quick and remind everybody that we do have a Q&A panel. So if you have questions that come up as Jose is reviewing these requirements, please go ahead and type those into the Q&A panel and we'll be addressing them here in a few minutes.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ben. So there's also, the fact that or the clarification that when you do extension of scopes, the audits must be physical, because you want to make sure, if you extend your scope either for a setting or for a standard, you want to make sure that the auditor takes a look at the additional risks of the setting or the standard. And this is why this portion is to be a physical visit. Then, of course, you can do the rest of it online when it comes to, okay, show me the qualification of the instructors to deliver the new module, and show me the lesson plan, that you have prepared for this new module. Historically, if those who have been with us, for years, there's been an evolution on the number of participants for an audit. So in the beginning, we had a requirement, that there had to be a minimum number of participants, which initially was the maximum ratio. Then we simplified this to 4. But then the question was, why 4 and not 3? Why 4 and not 5? So we've come up with a better way to understand, what is the minimum number of participants in a training which is being witnessed. So as long as there's a minimum number of participants so that the practical exercises and the theory can be taught, that will be sufficient. However, if there is 2 people in a standard that has been witnessed, the auditor may question the training provider. So, okay, there's 2 people here, and you're showing that you have well under control these standard when there's 2 people attending. But what if you go to the maximum ratio? Do you think you will still be able to match the duration of the standard? So this may be questioned during the audit. But again, there is a simplification on the way the training has been witnessed in regards to the number of participants. Then there is another question, which is about digital training. Digital training is being looked at the moment, because we have new technologies out there, like virtual reality, and there are some of the modules being developed in that technology or in that setting. So this has been looked at the moment. However, there needs to be an understanding, on the concept of blended training, which is what we have seen until very recently, which is part of the training is going to remain the same. So the practical training is going to still be done in the same way it was done, but now you're going to go through a section of the training is going to be done online through e-learning, as an example. So we're just introducing this blended learning or blended training, just terminology. And also there's a reference to BSTAP, which was released during the pandemic, and just to make sure there's clarity on how this needs to be audited. There's been also a simplification in regards the audit report. We previously included that for every audit report, there had to be a technical review, and there were concerns raised by the certification bodies that this was not the case in other schemes. And this was only the case when you issue a new certificate, but not for the surveillance audits. And we have adopted this practice. So when there's a new certificate, there needs to be a technical review for the audit report, which generates this certificate, and not for the surveillance audits. And then we are coming to the changes in the multi-site scheme, and it's there's another simplification, in regards to this. So if you have 4 sites and 3 of the sites have been delivering PST, for example, and I want to deliver PST in the 4th site, does training need to be witnessed, considering that the same equipment and the same lesson plans are going to be used, because this is a multi-site, and we've simplified this, because if that's going to be the same, the reality is that the differences are going to be in the qualification of the instructors. The type of equipment with this new site is going to be using, is it going to be the same as for the other sites? Is it going to be different? And then, of course, you want to make sure that the delivery of the training, is safe, and you want to make sure that the auditor reviews the risk assessments for the delivery of the training. But again, this is a simplification in the case of the multi-sites. In regards the internal auditors, there was a there was a confusion, or there was some clarification further needed on what do the internal auditors need to, how should they be qualified? And what we were saying is that the auditors, or the internal auditors, need to go through AQT. But then, one of the requirements to join AQT was that the auditor had to be 9001 or 45001 qualified. What we have done is just be mindful that there are other, audit courses or audit skill courses that have been developed by the larger training providers. And these internal courses may be as good as or better than the ones like 9001 or 45001. So there's an option, for the multi-site to say or to explain that their auditors are going into AQT and they've been trained internally through this specific course in which they got familiar, as an audit with the auditor skills. And because the internal auditors, may not have any previous auditing experience, maybe good instructors that want to do audits in other training, in other sites. And for this, before you join in the AQT, which is in which you're expected to have certain expertise in auditing, what we are now saying is, okay, either you do this or you have the alternative of developing your own course. There was also a discussion, on how long, did it take for the certification body to review internal audits. Initially, we've been piloting this for 6 months. We thought that 4 hours could be enough for this, but some of the certification bodies and even the training providers have advised that in certain cases, maybe more time should be needed. So again, we're just providing now a range from half a day to 1 day. You will have all noted that we've removed the Annex 2, in which you had a template for your audit plan. That's in the end, there's been an evidence that each of the certification bodies manage the audit plans through their own templates. So there was not a need to have a suggested template. And with this, I finished the review of the most relevant changes in the new requirements.
All right, excellent. So we have several questions that have come in this morning, kind of a couple themes that are forming. But the first one I want to ask is, somebody asked, if a training provider is delivering a particular module in 3 settings, so fixed facility, mobile site, and on-site, so would they expect during the audit that they would still be doing a 3 hours of training observation, or would they expect at one of those locations to validate all 3, or would they expect the auditor to want to witness training the practical portion at those additional settings? So 3 + 1 + 1. How would that be planned?
Well, if this is for a single site, then the change in the requirements is that you wouldn't need to witness the training in the 3 settings. So it could be okay if the training is witnessed in one of the settings, and then for the other 2 settings, a shorter audit that doesn't include witnessing of training, but just takes a look at the equipment used and the risks which are additional to these new settings are looked at. But you are not going to need, that there's an instructor delivering training and an auditor witnessing that instructor for 3 hours if it's the same standard. So
that additional observation of that, additional setting would be more part of the QMS audit. Is that correct?
That's correct. And also, it is, I think that the thought process is that we need an auditor to verify that the training delivered on site is safe and that the portable equipment is the right one. And that's what we want the auditor to verify.
Right.
As part of the QMS, as you say, so as part of, sections 7 to 10, that's what the auditor could do.
Excellent. Thanks. This one's regarding the combination of modules. So we have a combined working at heights and manual handling. The question is, if a training provider during their initial audit is certified for working at heights and manual handling combined, are they also certified to deliver individually working at heights and individually manual handling?
Yeah, I mean, that would be the case. Because I mean, if they've been certified, in the combination, they have proved in the end, that they can deliver, both of the modules. So.
Right. Excellent. And similar to that, and I believe I know the answer to this question to be yes, but when a training provider is certified on a module, they are certified on the initial and the refresher, correct?
Yes. But something that if the training provider is certified in the initial, they have the initial certification. Yes, they are certified as well to deliver the refresher, which in the end is a shorter version of the initial module.
Right. Okay. So there's several questions in here around instructor certification. So I'm going to go through a couple of these. So the first one is, what kind of evidence is GWO and the auditors looking for to confirm the 100 hours of vocational training? What would you expect them to be able to demonstrate?
Well, this is a good question because we are now developing, other schemes to qualify instructors or other options in which instructors can be qualified, and we will release an update in the new requirements. However, the way we look at it now is there needs to be some proof, that the instructor has delivered this 100 hours of vocational training. And the proof, is to be solid enough that the auditor can validate it. So specifically, how does this need to be proved for each of the standards is something, that is challenging, to say for every standard. But I think that in the end, as an example, if somebody has been delivering, courses, and, electrical engineering, the auditor will ask for a proof that this has happened, and then the training provider will show ways, to prove this. So.
Right. Yeah, I know there's various ways. Sometimes people use it through, the employee's resume, or if they have training records of their own.
Yeah.
This question's around new standards being released. We're about to release a new standard here pretty soon. The question is, when a brand new module is created and the standard pathway for the participate, observe, co-deliver, deliver can't be followed as there's no experienced instructor in that standard, how would a training provider become qualified to deliver that new module?
That's also a very good question. And we are mindful that this is a challenge, especially for the new markets or for modules, which are newly released. And that's why we are currently developing an alternative way to the POCD that can be used to qualify instructors. And you will avoid bottlenecks, you will avoid situations in which, for the smaller regions, there is no other training provider you can use for the POCD, or there is another training provider, but because it's a competitor, there's not an interest to help somebody who will become your competitor. So there's a whole team working now in the way instructors can be qualified, and all this is going to be released in the new requirements. So these new ways to qualify instructors will be released soon. So I could say between the end of the year, and the early 2024.
Okay. This is another instructor qualification related question. This is regarding if an instructor is qualified to deliver a module, does that instructor also need to attend that module for refreshers every 2 years to keep their Windows certifications up to date on that particular module, or is essentially teaching that module and maintaining their proficiency through being the instructor is sufficient enough?
Well, there is an expectation that the instructors, are assessed every year, and there are several options through an internal auditor or through an experienced instructor, who has done the AQT. Or now there is not a requirement that this is the case for every module or standard the instructor is teaching. So there's a requirement that at a minimum somebody takes a look, at how the instructor, is behaving and interacting with course participants. And of course, I mean, the instructor, to maintain the certification or the qualification to teach a module, there is a minimum number of times that the instructor must have taught the module, because otherwise, if there's 2 years, without teaching a module, most likely the instructor, will have challenges with the changes in the module.
So kind of along the same lines, if it says in lieu of having access to a certified trainer to assess and approve a new trainer, can a training provider engage an auditing body to approve that new trainer?
Yes, there's an option. There's an option, to do this, and there is an alternative. At the moment, there's 2 ways to qualify instructors. One is through the standard POCD, and the other one is through an alternative process. The alternative process explains different ways in which instructors can be qualified. What we will release, as I said, in the next version of requirements, will be a far more detailed alternative process, which will be much easier to be followed and much easier to be audited by the auditors.
Okay, getting a lot of instructor qualification questions in this. Here's a question. It says, is it possible to use mock training to develop more instructors, or can instructors only be developed and qualified while observing real GWO module trainings?
Mock training is an option.
Okay. And then similarly, can observation of a prospective trainer and a trainer in development, their delivery of that training be undertaken remotely?
In regards the qualification of the instructor, yes, there is an option. And that's in the requirements for certification. So the remote witnessing of training need to be done in a way. So we make a reference to 2 cameras, one focused at the instructor, another focused at the course participants, so that you can see the interaction between both. And as long as all these, these requirements, which are included in the remote auditing, are observed, this is possible. Yes.
Right. So using the same requirements for remote auditing for remote observation of the instructor during their qualification.
Yes.
Okay. And if whoever wrote that question, if you're not familiar, that requirement is actually in the requirements for certification.
Exactly.
Again, another plug for training providers getting familiar with the requirements for certification.
Yeah.
Okay. This question is about extension of scope. So if a training provider is certified to deliver all the BST modules, do they require a separate extension of scope certification to deliver the wind limited access course?
The requirement, the wind limited access course in the end is a new standard. And as a new standard, it has a specific duration and a specific learning objectives that need to be validated by a certification body. So how is the training provider, demonstrating that the learning objectives in this wind limited access course, are being followed? However, the auditing of the wind limited audit is much more simple than for the PST. So there's a much shorter audit, needed for this, in the aim of simplifying, this, and this audit can be done remotely.
Okay. It says there's a requirement for auditors to participate in 2 audits per year. Is that the same requirement for internal auditors for multi-site training providers?
No.
So how often would an internal auditor need to perform an audit?
The internal auditors, well, there's an expectation that the internal auditor, conducts a certain number of audits. The number of audits for the external auditors, as you mentioned, is 2. For the internal auditors, and I'm just talking by memory, I believe, that we didn't include this requirement that there had to be a minimum of 2 audits. But in any case, I mean, this if you go to the section of the internal auditors, and I'm just sharing this just for the easiness of the reply. The requirement is just that the internal auditors take the AQT and that they participate in the ADT. As internal auditors, you don't have a minimum number of audits that you need to comply with, because you may have a site in which, or you may have a multi-site with just 3 sites, and then you have 2 internal auditors, and then so it's strongly advised that if you're a multi-site, you don't have too many internal auditors, and you have, as few as possible, and they are the ones who travel around sites to do the audits.
Right. So there's a couple questions from the same participant here around the qualifications and experience of auditors and internal auditors about their ability to observe training in the training setting and know what good training looks like. The question boils down to is GWO doing anything specifically to help increase the capability of the auditors who observe training, both internal and certification body auditors, to know what good training looks like when they're observing this?
And the answer is yes. We developed the auditor qualification training as an initial course, so that auditors got familiar with the requirements. And there's part of this course, like a day of the course, is about what does good training look like, and the different taxonomy levels, and the communication between the instructors and the course participants. But then, we added an annual course, which is the auditors development training, and most of the focus of the course is, in addition to changes in the requirements, are things like this, which is trying to enhance the skills of the auditors in understanding what does good training look like. And so,
okay. Couple questions here, kind of on a similar vein about both witnessing of mock training during a certification and the use of remote observation through cameras. Is there any limits to whether or not, or how many times in a row that you can, either witness mock training, one, and remote training, two, during the audit process? And can that also be used for extension of scope?
The answer is, for the extension of a scope to a new standard or new setting, there needs to be a physical audit, because as we discussed, I mean, with a new standard or with a new setting comes new risks, and this risk needs to be taken a look at. So it needs to be through a physical visit. In regards the additional, the additional standards, or for a multi-site, then we're in a different situation, because I mean, it's only at one of the sites where you're going to need to witness the training, and then in the other sites you can do something which is much more simple.
Right. So we have several more questions in here, and some of them are of a similar vein, but for the sake of time, we want to shift gears a little bit towards the conversation about multi-site certification. I do ask everybody to keep typing your questions in here, because like I said, we are seeing some similar themes of questions which help us consider the way that we write our requirements. And we will be going through and answering as many of these as possible, either through a FAQ or to the individuals if we have your contact information. If you want to put your contact information in the question and answer section, or you can send that as well, and we can contact you directly. But shifting gears a little bit, so it was last October we released an update to the requirements that included what we called a multi-site certification. So Jose, can you talk through a little bit, just give an overview of what is unique about a multi-site certification and how that might benefit a training provider that has several locations?
Yeah, sure. Before the multi-site scheme, the reality is that the synergies between sites for the same training provider were not being taken a look at. So every site had to be audited independently, and every module witnessed at each of the sites. And then each of the sites, I mean, had to go through annual surveillance audits. And then the simplification included is, well, listen, if you share the same quality management systems and you qualify instructors the same way, and you basically, I mean, implement processes in the same way, why does each of the site need to go through an annual surveillance audit? If we are sampling records, why can we sample sites? If they are cohesive, if there's a lot of consistency among them. And this is what the multi-site scheme, observed. So now I mean, there's a sampling criteria for audits that can be used. And if you have 10 sites, you need to do 4 surveillance audits, but not 10. And then the other 6 sites will go through an internal auditor and will be audited internally.
And can you comment about how does the multi-site scheme with regards to the observation of training at each one of those locations versus the whole entity?
Yeah, following the same concept, when the multi-site scheme, didn't exist, the witnessing of training had to be done on each of the sites with the requirement that all the modules had to be witnessed every 24 months at each of the sites. Now this is not a requirement anymore. So it's not the certification body who needs to witness this every 24 months. This can be witnessed either by an external auditor or by an internal auditor. In the end, the goal here, because we have requirements for certification, requirements for training, with the end goal of, making sure that there's the quality of the training delivered. So the thought here is, okay, I mean, so why do training providers, multi-site training providers, need to invest in external audits at each of all of their sites every year? Why not just doing a mix and then having external auditors witnessing some of the sites, and then having a good internal auditor who may be a training instructor who has gone through AQT, just witnessing and just verifying that the quality is the one we're expecting.
Right. So yeah, excellent. So it sounds like we're relying a lot on the training providers with multi-sites to do a lot of their own internal auditing and present those records to the external auditor for validation. So I guess the question here also is, if a training provider that is under multi-site, say they want to add a new location as they're expanding their operations, or they're going to add a new module across all of these locations, how would a training provider with a multi-site certification extend their scope in those ways?
Well, if the training provider, I mean, want to extend the scope by adding a new standard, then without the multi-site scheme, each of the sites had to do the extension of the scope separately, and then training had to be witnessed for the new standard at each of the sites. Now we've eliminated this requirement, because if the lesson plan is the same for the new standard, what's the point witnessing the training 10 times if there's 10 sites? So there's going to be one audit. In this one audit, the auditor is going to take a look at the lesson plan, and it's going to take a look at the training material and the equipment, and then there'll be a verification that in each of the other 9 sites, the same equipment is being used, and if there are additional risks, the auditor will be asking, how do you control or assess the risks? But basically, we are applying the synergies of the multi-site, which we were not doing in the past. And I think the biggest change is that we were not taking benefit of the synergies when you are a multi-site.
So if that training provider wants to add their 11th location, how would that be different?
If they add their 11th location, one of the things that we have introduced is that if the 11th location is going to develop training against the standards that have already been audited at any other site, witnessing of training will not be a need. If they use the same lesson plans and the same training materials, what the auditor will focus on, instead of witnessing the training, is making sure that the instructors are qualified, making sure that the risks are under control, making sure that the equipment is being used, and no additional witnessing of training will be needed if that standard is already being provided or being delivered by any other site in the multi-site.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And you've mentioned a couple times about the auditor qualification training, or AQT. So how would a training provider in a multi-site scheme get their own internal auditors up to speed to be able to do these internal audits, and give us a little bit of information about the AQT course as well?
Well, the AQT course is a 3-day course in which I mean, the auditors get familiar with the requirements and the way that training is to be witnessed, and the audit report and the taxonomy levels. So the certification bodies, I mean, there's a requirement that the auditors that participate there are lead auditors, 9001, 45001, and this is complex, of course. For the internal auditors, I mean, what we are now saying is, well, either you do the 9001 or 45001 internal auditor training, which is 2 days, or to just develop your own auditor course, in which you basically explain how audits need to be conducted, and what does sampling mean, and what is an adequate sampling criteria. So we allow the training providers, the multi-sites, to develop their own course, and then the auditor who is familiar with the 9001 or 45001 will ask, So how are you verifying that auditors, as I said, are familiar with this or that? So
excellent. So definitely seems like there's a lot of benefits to large organizations that have a lot of these functions or want to build towards these capabilities to exploit, as you said, the synergies across multiple sites. So,
yeah.
you know, we acknowledge that transitioning from several single sites to a multi-site can be a challenging process, both for training providers and certification bodies. And so if that's something that you're looking into, please reach out to GWO through info@globalwindsafety.org. And we can schedule time with you, the training providers, and with your certification bodies to walk through the process. As Jose had mentioned, we've been doing this pilot with several training providers and certification bodies. So a lot of learning cycles under our belt, and we can definitely help you make a plan to transition to multi-site if that's interesting to you. So I just want to acknowledge to everybody who's typed in a question that we have not specifically been able to answer yet. We will be capturing these questions through the Zoom meeting and creating a series of answers to these questions because they are very complex, and we acknowledge that. The requirements for certification and requirements for training are very important documents, and we want to do our best to make sure that everybody understands what's in those. But just simply due to time, we couldn't get to each question today. So keep your eye out for a FAQ document to come out after this. And I just want to thank Jose and everybody for joining our call today. And again, if you have additional questions that come up later, please email those into info@globalwindsafety.org, and we will answer them as quickly as possible. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jose, and have a great night.
Bye-bye.